By the late 14th century, Ottoman armies pushed the border of Islam into Europe. Disastrous defeats suffered by the Christians at Maritza, Kosovo, and Nicopolis reverberated across the West. European rulers would not challenge the Ottomans for another 50 years. Sultan Bayezid, returning across the Bosphorus Strait, had continued the expansion into Anatolia. A formidable empire was forming, stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates. Meanwhile, another powerful empire emerged in the east. Timur had proclaimed himself heir to the Ilkhanids and their right to rule over Anatolia. Poised to re-establish the Mongol Empire, he marched west into Ottoman territory. The 20th of July 1402 would become an important point in the history of Anatolia and the Balkans. On that day, two of the greatest conquerors of their time met on the dusty plain outside Ankara. In the winter months of 1396, news of the defeat at Nicopolis spread across Europe. Sultan Bayezid's troops captured the remnants of the Christian army and led them in chains on a trek to Gallipoli. King Sigismund of Hungary was among the few who managed to escape the carnage. Fearing the long march back home, he embarked on a journey down the Danube and sailed towards Constantinople, intending to reach Hungary by sea. His troops were less fortunate, lingering in captivity for 2 years. They were finally sold to a French delegation for a sum equal to 700 kilograms of gold. Meanwhile, the victorious Sultan Bayezid pacified the rebellious Vuk Brankovic of Serbia and destroyed the recalcitrant Tsardom of Vidin, sending its ruler to Basra, where he died in captivity. By now the master of the Balkan Peninsula, and with the prestige of being the Sultan of Rum, Bayezid had proved more than equal to his forefathers. But these possessions were divided by the Sea of Marmara and the Dardanelles. This meant that a campaign on one side usually resulted in rebellion on the other. Indeed, while Bayezid was preoccupied with the Crusade of Nicopolis, the Bey of Karaman took Ankara by force in 1396. He captured the Ottoman governor of Anatolia, a grave insult to the court in Adrianople. Bayezid the Thunderbolt, the retribution in 1397, with the European threat gone, Bayezid crossed into Anatolia once more. The Ottoman dynasty had long defined itself as Ghazis, meaning warriors of the faith, but they were often at war with their Muslim brethren for dominance in Anatolia. Bayezid's swift march reflected his moniker, the Thunderbolt. The Ottoman Sultan reduced the Karamid forces at Konya, before capturing and executing Ali Bey. He continued the eastward push in 1398, using the instability in the region to capture Shivas and much of the Aretna Beylik. In doing so, Ottoman domination over Anatolia was established. A year later, in 1399, Bayezid exploited the death of the Mamluk Sultan Berkuk to cross the Taurus Mountains. Berkuk's son and heir Farek was only 10 years old, and unable to mount a defense. The conquest of the Malatya region was an important step, for it gave Bayezid access to the Euphrates, a vital logistical waterway. Moreover, with the Taurus Mountains behind him, the road into the plains of northern Syria was now open. Bayezid's aggressive policy in the east was a resounding success. But it brought him into conflict with another emerging superpower. Nearly 30 years before, in 1370, then a little-known Turco-Mongol emir in Transoxiana, Timur, established his domain with Samarkand as the capital. He used the waning influence of the Chagatai Khanate, one of the successor states of Genghis Khan's great empire, to impose his rule on much of Central Asia. Timur spent the next 30 years on campaign, much like the Mongols did a century before. He took the medieval world by storm. In spectacular fashion, Timur expanded his empire into India, Persia, and the Middle East, winning countless battles and successfully besieging the most formidable of cities. His raiding expeditions took him across the Caucasus Mountains, beyond the banks of the Volga River, defeating the armies of the Mongol Golden Horde and sacking countless cities, reaching not far from Moscow itself, before turning back south, ravaging his way towards the rich coastal cities of the Crimean Peninsula. The final leg of the expedition took him east to the Ural River, before he returned to friendly territory. This was a trail of destruction 10,000 kilometers long, so effective that it permanently weakened the Golden Horde, ending their grip over Russia. By the year 1400, Timur was an awe-inspiring war leader, known across Asia and Europe. His formidable army was composed of grizzled veterans who rode with him across 2 continents. When the enemy smiles, he knows your secret. Proclaiming himself heir to the Ilkhanids and the Seljuks, Timur claimed the right to rule over Anatolia. To this end, he sought alliances in the region. The heirs to the beyliks of Eretna and Karaman, recently conquered by Bayezid, accepted Timur's offer in the hope of receiving military aid to re-establish their rule. Other Turkic nobles from conquered beyliks in western Anatolia also flocked to Timur, fleeing Bayezid's attempts to exterminate local dynasties and establish central Ottoman authority in Anatolia. Conversely, Timur's own expansion drove out the ruling elite of Iraq, Persia, and Azerbaijan, who sought refuge at Bayezid's court. Most notable of these were Sultan Ahmad Jalir and Sultan Kara Yusuf. Offering protection to each other's political rivals paved the way for war. Perhaps most significantly, the Mamluk Sultanate, pressured by Timur, accepted his suzerainty, albeit only nominally. Still, this was enough to secure his southern flank. Timur could now turn his armies squarely against the Ottomans. The pretext for war came in the year 1400, when Bayezid sent a letter to Mudahartin, the emir of the city of Erzincan, who recently sided with Timur. Bayezid demanded obedience and tribute paid. Mudahartin refused, instead showing the letter to Timur and appealing for his help. Aware that he cannot allow his vassals to be harassed, Timur threatened Bayezid, writing, "Be content with the lands you seized from the unbelievers, but return the provinces you stole from fellow Muslims, or I will be their avenger." Bayezid returned in insult and kind, ordering the beards of Timur's envoys to be shaved, before returning them to their master in disgrace, with a message: "I will come find you. And if you refuse to fight me, I will chase you to India if I have to." Negotiations were over. In mid-August 1400, Timur advanced along the Halis River, intending to besiege Shivas, the first step in his planned invasion of Anatolia. Bayezid was preoccupied with the siege of Constantinople, and could not respond to the incursion. But he prepared to muster an army and had sent envoys to the Mamluk Sultan, suggesting they join forces against the Tatar invaders. Farek was not impressed but kept the lines of communication open with the Ottoman court. When Timur's spies informed him of the diplomatic talks taking place between Bayezid and Farek, he sent envoys of his own to Damascus to reaffirm his suzerainty over the Mamluks. What transpired at the meeting is unknown, but it ended with the arrest and execution of the Timurid envoys. By early September, Timur captured Shiva's castle, then proceeded to burn and destroy it, killing 4,000 Ottoman Sipahis in the process. The Muslim population was spared, but the Armenian Christians were put to the sword wholesale, many burned alive. Then, instead of continuing the planned invasion of Anatolia, he turned south to reassert his authority over the Mamluks. Dividing his army, the multiple columns crisscrossed the Taurus Mountains, leaving destruction in their wake. A not-so-subtle reminder of the fate that would befall all those who oppose him. Timurid forces devastated the cities of Elbistan and Malatya before descending into Syria. The city of Adiyaman fell soon after, and the fortress of Besni was overrun. Next was the city of Antep. By now, the Mamluks had gathered near Aleppo, under the command of Timurtash. On the 30th of October, Timur defeated the Mamluk army and entered the city of Aleppo. The citadel surrendered by the 3rd of November. Continuing south, the Timurids were met with little resistance. The local garrisons were unable to cope with the large mobile army that swept them aside as they went. Hama, Homs, and Baalbek were pillaged. By November, Timur besieged Damascus. Throughout November and December, Sultan Farek's forces gathered to the south, in preparation to relieve the city. On the 25th of December, the Mamluk army attacked the Timurid siege lines. But once again, they were defeated and repulsed. The siege of Damascus continued until it was captured in January 1401. Subsequently, the city was sacked and set ablaze. 2 months later, in March, Timur finally departed Damascus, taking with him thousands of craftsmen, writers and scholars, including the famous Ibn Arab Shah. The punitive expedition into Syria struck fear into Sultan Farrukh, thus erasing any chance of an alliance between the Mamluks and the Ottomans. Bayezid remained busy at Constantinople, sensing that he was on the verge of capturing the ancient capital of the Roman emperors. Although Constantinople still received supplies via the sea, the sustained pressure was enough to force Emperor Manuel to leave and spend 2 years touring the courts of Europe, begging for help. This left his nephew John as the regent in Constantinople. By the spring of 1401, the blockade had lasted for 7 years, taking a significant toll on the city. It was evident from the correspondence between John and Bayezid that the regent of Constantinople considered surrendering the city to the Ottomans, wishing to end the suffering. But Timur, by now back at his headquarters in Carabao, was not idle. Trying to weaken Bayezid, he opened diplomatic talks with John, the regent of Constantinople, and Manuel III, the emperor of Trebizond, offering his protection against the Ottomans, in return for them providing ships for the Timurid army. Both accepted, galvanized by the offer. Whether Timur was aware of how close Bayezid was to forcing the surrender of Constantinople is not known. His promise of aid encouraged John to stop all negotiations with the Ottoman Sultan. However, by the time he returned from Syria in the summer of 1401, it was too late in the year to continue the invasion into Anatolia. To keep his large army active and on the move, he launched his 7th expedition into Georgia, to subdue the kingdom and secure his northern flank. The campaign went on for several months. This suited Timur, for he was all too aware that the troops needed to be paid and fed, and with an army numbering over 100,000 soldiers and non-combatants, this could only be achieved through continued conquest and plunder. Moreover, keeping his emirs close to him on the march prevented them from returning to their homelands and stirring up revolts. Meanwhile, Bayezid, failing to persuade John to surrender the keys to Constantinople, left the siege unattended. He headed east to retake Shivas and capture Erzincan. This campaign, as well as Timur's invasion of Georgia, would be completed by late autumn of 1401. And as the year drew to a close, both leaders prepared for the inevitable battle. 1402, the reckoning. In early 1402, Timur marched his troops out of winter quarters towards the Ottoman border. His emirs, however, advised him against the campaign, arguing that the men were weary after spending 3 years on the march. Moreover, the emirs feared Bayezid's leadership on the battlefield and the resources readily available to him in Anatolia. Timur remained undeterred. However, he knew that Bayezid was far more formidable than any opponent he had faced before. Timur perhaps secretly viewed Bayezid as his equal. Thus, he sent word to his grandson Muhammad in Samarkand, ordering him to bring fresh troops and join him in Anatolia. According to medieval accounts, over the next 2 months the Timurid army swelled up to 140,000, though between 30 and 50% of these were likely camp followers, servants, and slaves. By the spring of 1402, Bayezid massed his own army of some 85,000 troops and camp followers at Basra, in preparation for a march east to meet the invaders. 2 massive columns crossed the northeastern Ottoman border. 1. Marched along the Trebizond border. The main body, commanded by Timur, advanced through Erzurum and towards Erzincan. Splitting his force made it possible to move faster through enemy territory. The plan was for the columns to converge on Shivas. Meanwhile, Bayezid's army slowly converged just east of Ankara. By this time the Timurids reached Shivas, where they were met by Ottoman envoys. Timur received the Ottoman delegation. But as soon as the dialogue started, he rejected their gifts, thereby confirming he did not wish to negotiate a truce. Both parties promptly insisted on their demands, glorifying the strengths of their respective armies in an effort to intimidate each other. Timur listed the many contingents from across his empire. Banners from the Asian steppe, Persia, India, Georgia, and other leaders loyal to him. Tens of thousands of feared horse archers. Contingents of heavy cavalry in plate, or male. A large contingent of elephants from India, a terrifying shock weapon. Timur was confident that this impressive list would intimidate the Ottomans. But the Ottoman envoys fired back, listing all the great men loyal to Bayezid. Professional infantry at the core of his army. Armored feudal Sipahi cavalry. From the Balkans, the heavily armored Serbian cavalry, commanded by Stefan Lazarevic. A substantial infantry contingent led by the nobles from Bulgaria and northern Greece. Mounted Kipchak Tatars recruited from Crimea, along with armored Mamluk mercenary cavalry. And thousands of Turkic horsemen and infantry levied from across Anatolia. Once the two parties blew off steam and the shouting match in the tent died down, it was clear that neither side would budge. If either Timur or Bayezid's envoys were impressed by the show of force on each side, they didn't show it. Though undoubtedly, either had ever faced a foe of this strength. From Ankara, Bayezid advanced east to meet the invading menace, after receiving reports that Timur was ravaging the area around Sivas. The Sultan's advisors, however, urged that a defensive line be formed near Ankara to receive the attack, closer to their main supply lines. But it was not lost on the Ottoman Sultan that the forested hilly terrain in the Sivas region would put his majority infantry army at an advantage over the predominantly mounted Timurid force. He was eager to catch his opponent in Sivas. It was now late June, however, and the laborious march in the summer heat took its toll on the troops. About a week later, Timur suddenly moved his forces southwest after receiving reports that Bayezid was closing in, leaving a diversionary force behind to guard the rear. He too was aware that the terrain around Sivas did not favor him and wanted to avoid confronting Bayezid there. Timur marched along the banks of the Halis River, the route he used 2 years prior. His intention was to go around Bayezid and strike Kayseri. There, he would stop to rest his troops and gather fodder for the horses, before continuing towards Ankara. Meanwhile, Bayezid had reached Tokat, just to the northwest of the city of Sivas. He clashed with what he thought was Timur's vanguard. Quickly brushing aside the token force, Ottoman scouts dispersed to look for signs of the enemy. Some 2 days later, they found tracks of an army moving towards the southwest. Shocked by the realization that the enemy was now behind him, the Ottoman Sultan faced about and went back the way he came. Timur commanded some 90,000 fighting men. Another 50,000 camp followers tended to the carts, pack animals and siege weapons. This heavy reliance on a massive baggage train allowed him to move his massive army quickly through enemy territory without the need to stop to forage. Bayezid, meanwhile, could muster 60,000 troops, which were accompanied by around 20,000 camp followers. Timur's army was clearly the larger one, but not overwhelmingly so. The Sultan from Samarkand reached Ankara with little opposition and put the city to siege. Surveying the flat plain northeast of the city, Timur was satisfied that this is where he would fight Bayezid. By the 20th of July, the thunderbolt reached the battlefield. Both commanders were aware of each other's military prowess. Bayezid was concerned about Timur's expert ability in leading his mobile nomadic cavalry and horse archers. Timur, on the other hand, worried about Bayezid's tight control of his disciplined professional infantry and astute use of heavy cavalry. Both cautious, Timur deployed with his back to hilly terrain to avoid a potential ambush. Bayezid, meanwhile, anchored his right wing on a ridge and his left wing to the Chubuk stream, to protect against flanking attacks. In the center stood the Azep infantry, behind a screen of archers. Behind them were several thousand elite Janissary troops and Capiculu Sipahi heavy cavalry, Bayezid's most trusted troops. The Sultan took command in the center, together with his sons Isa, Mustafa, and Musa, as well as his Grand Vizier Chandralazade Ali Pasha. On the right wing, Bayezid positioned the 5,000-strong Serbian contingent, commanded by his trusted vassal and brother-in-law, Prince Stefan Lazarevic. The Serbian heavy cavalry, clad in black armor, were the heaviest units on the field, famous throughout Europe for their proficiency in battle. Supporting them was the veteran Serbian infantry. Behind them were the Albanian mercenaries and volunteers. Kara Timurtaş Pasha commanded an Anatolian cavalry force alongside Lazarevic Serbians, taking their place between them and the central front line. On the Ottoman left wing, the Sultan's son and heir Suleiman commanded the cavalry and infantry recruited from the Balkans, mainly from the recently conquered Bulgaria, along with several contingents from the Turkic beyliks of Anatolia. Behind them were the Kipchak Tatar mercenaries from Crimea. Finally, Bayezid's son Mehmet commanded the infantry reserve, which was bolstered with a force of Turkoman Karakoyunlu cavalry. Crucial to the Sultan's plan was the subtle ridge that ran along his battle line. His plan was to use this defendable elevation to offset the numerical superiority of the enemy. On the other side of the battlefield, the Timurid vanguard was comprised of 32 Indian war elephants, which were supplied with early explosive devices, fueled by naphtha, a form of hideously damaging napalm. Combined with archers shooting from the boxes atop their backs, one can only imagine the psychological effect these gigantic monsters and the injuries they could inflict had on Bayezid's western troops. Timur next placed a vast screen of horse archers across his battle line, a standard tactic of nomadic armies. A camp was set up behind each wing, tasked with resupplying these riders with arrows, fresh horses, and other provisions during the battle. Timur's son Miran Shah commanded the right wing, composed of Chagatai horse archers, as well as armored cavalry from India, Georgia, and some Mamluk mercenaries. To the left of them was a mix of cavalry from Central Asia and Persia. In the center, Timur took charge of the elite armored cavalry, along with mounted units from Samarkand and contingents of the Surbadari infantry. On the left wing, Timur's son Shah Rukh commanded a large contingent of Chagatai cavalry, joined by Anatolian beys. Supporting them on their right were a mix of Armenian and Turkoman cavalry and footmen, as well as other units recruited from across the Middle East. Finally, Timur's grandson and heir Muhammad Mirza was placed in charge of the reserve cavalry force. The battle began about 10 a.m. with the general advance of Timur's army. The horse archers rode ahead, while the rest of the army lagged behind, allowing time for the mounted archers to soften the Ottoman line or bait them into charging into the open. The initial plan was to put pressure on Suleiman, where the ground was flatter and the Ottoman position more vulnerable to envelopment. Timur's nomadic riders on the right were the first to unleash a storm of arrows. Unnerved and taking losses, the Balkan troops nevertheless withstood the volleys. Shortly after, Shah Rukh's archers concentrated their volleys on Lazarevic's contingent. Most of the arrow fire was focused on the Serbian prince's banner, but the projectiles were ineffective against the heavily armored troops. In the center, confronted with waves of volleys unleashed by the Chagatai riders, the Ottoman foot archers withdrew onto the high ground behind the infantry and continued to respond with volleys of their own. Like thousands of hornets, Timurid archers swarmed in front of the static Ottoman line, looking for a weak spot. Riders rushed in, firing off their bows at nearly point-blank range, before circling back, only to be replaced by a new wave of swift-moving archers. After a while, commotion began in the Ottoman Azep ranks. For the Timurid archers, this was like sharks smelling blood. From experience, they knew that this part of the enemy line was feeling the pressure of the constant barrage. On cue, all Timurid riders focused their arrows on the wavering Azep infantry, trying to either force them to flee or bait them into charging forward. But Bayezid commanded the men to hold the line, despite the casualties, demonstrating his strong leadership. He knew that by now the nomadic riders were low on arrows and that the first wave was nearly over. Indeed, not long after, Timur's horse archers retreated, their quivers empty. They rode back towards the camps in the rear to replenish their ammo and get fresh horses, passing through the incoming wave of Timurid cavalry that switched from a trot to full gallop towards the enemy line. Ottoman archers loosed their arrows when the central Timurid formation came into range. Moments later, Timur's cavalry crashed into the Ottoman left. In the center, the momentum of the charge pushed back the Azep infantry, inflicting severe casualties. Bayezid ordered the archers to focus all of their support on the Azep sector by lobbing arrows into the enemy line. The Sultan sent in the Janissaries to stabilize the center. Due to the ferocity of the Timurid charge, he had no choice but to commit his best infantry earlier than planned. Meanwhile, on the right, the Anatolians under Timurtas held their formation, but the more experienced Persian infantry drove them back. The Serbian heavy cavalry, meanwhile, countercharged the elite contingent of Middle Eastern and Anatolian formations. Serbian swords and lances tore through their formation, penetrating armor and dismounting riders. In the center, while the Azeps continued to struggle for cohesion, the disciplined Janissaries held strong, inflicting heavy losses on the Timurids. Fearing that his center could break, Timur responded by reinforcing the attack. Back on the right, by now the Serbian heavy cavalry pushed down the gentle hill, driving the enemy back across the plain. Unsupported, they risked being dangerously separated from the rest of the Ottoman line. Bayezid recognized the advance on the right and sent an urgent message to Stefan to restrain his men from advancing any further and pull back. The center, the unrelenting Janissaries, had worn down the Timurids and forced them back. Timur and his captains made sure to control the fighting. Withdrawal, so it didn't turn into a rout. The Janissaries eventually broke off and did not pursue, using the time to rest, regroup, and replace broken weapons and shields. Timur, meanwhile, seeing that his attacks on the left and center were repulsed, ordered the men back, as a new wave of archers was on its way. Bayezid likewise ordered the men to reform, steeling them for the next phase of the battle. Not wanting to give any respite to the enemy, Timur pulled back the line to make room for the renewed attack by his mounted archers. Now, with fresh horses and replenished quivers, the agile riders weaved their way through the retreating cavalry to begin another round of missile attacks on the Ottomans. Their main target in the center was, again, the Azep infantry, who were yet to fully regain their composure after the first wave. But this time, Ottoman archers, being on foot and on elevated ground, were able to fire more accurately than their mounted counterparts, their deadly volleys felling many Timurid riders. On the other side of the battlefield, Timur assigned 2 units from the rear to reinforce the vanguard in preparation for the next assault. In addition, he ordered his son Miran Shah to shift some of the Persian cavalry to the left wing, realizing that more force will be needed against the Serbian contingent in the next wave. Meanwhile, the swarm of activity continued in front of the Ottoman line, as the steppe riders continued to chip away at Bayezid's men. While losses mounted, the Ottoman discipline held, the men valiantly withstanding the barrage of arrows. Having reshuffled his lines, Timur launched the second attack. His horse archers once again gradually swerved around and began withdrawing to the rear to mount fresh horses and restock on arrows. Bayezid could see the stronger concentration of troops in the Timurid center. Worried about the endurance of the Azep infantry, he moved all of his archers behind them to provide additional close-range support. Additional Janissary units were sent forward to strengthen the center. From the Ottoman rear, Mehmet sent reinforcements to the Ottoman right wing, anticipating that this time the Serbian contingent will be struck with much greater force. In addition, Bayezid tasked the Albanian mercenary cavalry to aid Stefan in the ridge sector. Timur, wanting to further increase pressure, ordered Shah Rukh to fully commit the left wing, and moved 2 reserve units to bolster his numbers. Fully committing Shah Rukh at the last moment was a brilliant move, as it gave Bayezid little time to react. Timur was 1 step ahead. Meanwhile, the Ottomans received the attack on their right. In the chaos, the lines mixed. The overwhelming numbers Timur committed against the Serbian contingent were expected to pin down the heavily armored knights, while the cavalry on the right wing broke through to roll up the Ottoman line. Timur's fresh units on the far left managed to gain ground and fight their way across the ridge. But opposing them, Stefan and his veterans were unyielding, despite being outnumbered almost 2 to 1. After about 30 minutes of fighting, the Ottoman right had stopped the enemy once again. It was now around noon. 2 hours had passed since the fighting began. In the center, the reinforced Timurid vanguard pinned down the Ottomans, the weight of the attack mostly focused on the Azep infantry. However, this time supported by the Janissaries and concentrated volleys of the foot archers, the Azep line held. But on the Ottoman left wing, the situation looked grim. The Anatolian infantry and cavalry under Suleiman buckled against Miranshah's men. Bayezid reacted quickly, sending forward the Tatar mercenaries. But instead of aiding the Anatolians, the Tatars switched sides and joined Timur's troops in decimating the Ottoman left. The reason for their defection remains unclear. As mercenaries, perhaps they thought that joining Timur would be more rewarding. Another possibility is they decided to join their nomadic brethren. Caught between the Tatars and the Timurids in a merciless crossfire, many Ottoman troops under Suleiman's command fled, trying to get away from the slaughter. Bayezid urgently sent the armored Sipahi cavalry under his son Mem to prevent his left wing from disintegrating. Struck from behind, the lightly armored Kipchaks were no match against the Sipahis. Unable to wiggle away, they were cut to pieces in close quarters. Nevertheless, the Anatolians were still hard-pressed. Observing the situation and the implosion of the Ottoman left wing, Timur sent forward additional units to press the advantage. However, by around 1 p.m. it seemed that Bayezid succeeded in stabilizing this sector with Mem's reserves, despite the increasing pressure. But then, a calamity for the Ottomans. Among Timur's reinforcements, banners of Karaman, Aydin, and Mentesh flapped in the wind. These were the Turkic lords, previously defeated by Bayezid during his expansion in Anatolia, some of whom fled to join Timur. Now serving the Ottomans, they could see the standards of their former brethren within Timurid ranks. And some of these who had been fighting under the command Kara Timurtaş Pasha. On the center right also switched sides. Worse, by now the nomadic horse archers had returned, lobbing arrows at the Ottomans as they rode past. Bayezid and Mehmed both urgently sent more troops to shore up their wings. By now, Suleiman had lost control of the Ottoman left. With his personal retinue he fought his way out and began retreating from the field. Seeing his son's banner abandoning the front line, Bayezid sent word to the Serbian Prince Stefan on the opposite wing, requesting his presence on the left to shore up the ranks and instill discipline. Timur's elite Mamluks rushed into the gap left in the Serbian line by the departing Stefan. But the breakthrough was stopped by the veteran Serbian infantry. However, parts of the Ottoman right began to waver after enduring hours of fighting, defections, and a constant barrage of arrows. Crossing the battlefield to join the fighting on the left, Stefan sent a messenger to the Sultan, urging him to conduct a fighting retreat, or at least leave the command in the hands of his sons and withdraw to safety. But in Bayezid's mind, fleeing was unacceptable. He was not just some mediocre emir. He was the Ottoman Sultan who had doubled the territory of the empire inherited from his forefathers. Undefeated in battle. Glancing once more to his left, Bayezid could see that the wing there had stabilized. Taking a deep breath and steeling himself, the Ottoman Sultan jerked his steed and led the remaining Sipahis forward. Joining the Janissaries in the center, Bayezid's presence lifted the spirits of the men. Despite the punishment they've endured. For much of the afternoon, the elite Janissary infantry frenziedly hacked their way forward, driving back the Timurid center. Meanwhile, on the Ottoman left, Prince Stefan joined the fighting with a handful of lieutenants that were still alive, galvanizing the troops. Exchanging blow after blow, it was the Timurid troops who succumbed to the pressure. Seeing that the battle was turning against him, Timur sent in the last of his reserves. Some were to join Miranshah to help finish off the Ottoman left wing. The rest were tasked with joining the attack against the Ottoman right and attempt once more to break the resolve of the Serbian contingent, now that their leader Prince Stefan was absent. Timur also sent in many of the horse archers who had run out of arrows to join the desperate struggle. Finally, Timur unleashed his 32 elephants. Even through the din of battle, the rumbling of the ground could be felt as the Indian riders spurred on the massive animals. In one of the last orders of the day, the Sultan from Samarkand ordered the units in the center to clear a path for the Indian riders. Towering over 3 meters and weighing more than 4 tons, the shadows of the 32 massive beasts would be the last sight of many in their path. With iron determination, the Janissaries refused to yield as the giant beasts ripped right through them. Gaping holes were left in the Ottoman central formations, as scores of men were trampled by the rampaging elephants. Most of the frightened animals finally collapsed in the midst of the Ottoman soldiers, succumbing to the injuries they sustained from hundreds of sword blows. A few of the elephants that survived, punching through the Ottoman line, proceeded to flee the field. Though the carnage by Timur's elephants had stopped, the damage inflicted was irreparable. Worse, the Ottoman army was by now fully committed. With no reinforcements left to bolster the left wing and fill the shattered units in the center, they were overwhelmed across the entire battle line. Timur knew that now was the time. He ordered a general advance. Every man still able to hold a weapon was brought forward. The Ottoman line was firmly on the back foot. Within the hour, large sections of the Ottoman line broke and fled. Most of the men on the left wing routed. Exhausted, some men simply gave up and collapsed to the ground. Others found the strength to flee the carnage. Others still remained in the fight. Prince Stefan again urged the Sultan to retreat. But Bayezid refused. This time his resolve to stay and fight was perhaps to allow his sons to escape to safety. Prince Stefan formed an escort and fought his way out. The Sultan's sons, Mehmet, Suleiman, and Isa managed to retreat. But Musa and Mustafa were captured during the fighting. As the Ottoman army was reduced, contingents still offering resistance were cornered and surrounded. In a dramatic last stand, Bayezid stood valiantly on the hill of Kattletepe with his janissaries, who fought and died next to their sultan. They repelled waves of attacks until late in the afternoon, before finally being ground down. Late in the day, a breakout was attempted. Bayezid and his select retinue tried fighting their way eastward, but to no avail. Timur had won the day. His army suffered around 15,000 dead and wounded. In stark contrast, some 30,000 Ottoman troops lay dead on the field, half of the army that fought in the Battle of Ankara. The terrifying death toll was evident across the dusty plain of Chubuk. The most disastrous, however, was the capture of the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid. With the crushing victory at Ankara and the capture of the Ottoman Sultan, Timur was now the undisputed master of Anatolia. Pushing west, he conquered one of the last Crusader enclaves in Asia, the Knights of St. John's fortress at Smyrna. Timur restored the Turkic Emirates, most notably Karaman, incorporating them into his sphere of influence. In a show of dominance, he sent a message to Bayezid's son and heir, Suleiman Kelebai, granting him the Balkan provinces. But Timur could not linger in Anatolia for long. He had to keep his army on the move, and he soon marched back the way he came. By now an old man, in his 60s, Timur breathed his final breath. In 1405, during a campaign directed at China, the empire he built did not survive for long. Ironically, the Ottoman Empire he dismantled at Ankara did survive. After a period of civil wars, capable new sultans emerged. Within a few decades, the Ottoman Empire would re-emerge as the preeminent power in Europe and the Middle East.